Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media with a special grant from the Ramjack Corporation. Very excited for a first-timer here today. He's a muckety-muck editor at The Atlantic. I can't remember. It's executive editor, deputy executive editor, the Jeffrey Goldberg's Beria, whatever. We'll come up with a title. It's also very exciting for me because he is one of the extreme few guests we've ever had on here with an even more Jewish-sounding name than my own. It's just very rare that happens. He's also, Yoni Appelbaum, I should say, is also the author of Stuck, How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Yoni Appelbaum, welcome to the Remnant.
Hey, I'm thrilled to be here.
All right, so book authors always get the first question here because it's the question I always want to get when I'm on a book tour. What's your book about?
The book is about the thing that made America great in the first place, which was our remarkable propensity for moving from one place to another, how that made the country prosperous and pluralistic and dynamic. And then over the last 50 years, how a set of changes, largely driven by progressives, have slowly ground that engine to a halt and left us as a country embittered, divided, slowed growth, and really choked off the American dream.
Okay, so I really enjoy this book for a host of reasons. One of them is just pure useful factoids for column writing. It's chock full of that kind of thing. But two, because of as someone who is a devotee of the first wave neoconservatives who are all domestic policy people, this feels like a wonderful moment for people like Ed Banfield and Nat Glazer to rise from the grave and say, I told you so. But we'll get to that part of it in a little bit. First of all, just can you, I have them in front of me, but if better coming from you, just give people a better sense of just the numbers here, of how much more mobile we used to be, because it really flies in the face of all of this sort of conventional wisdom, including conventional wisdom I have been trafficked in, and it was a good corrective for me personally about how we're such a mobile society now and people change jobs more. In fact, all of that stuff has slowed down much more than I think the average person realizes.
Yeah, we change jobs less often than we used to. We start businesses at like half the rate we did half a century ago. We, at the peak of American mobility, probably 1 out of 3 Americans moved every year. As late as 1970, it was 1 out of 5. And we set a dismal new record last year. We got new numbers from the census in December. It's down to 1 out of 13. And that slide in mobility from 1 out of 5 to 1 out of 13 has been a steady 50-year decline through good economic times and bad, through Republican administrations and Democratic ones. And I think it's the biggest and least remarked social change in the contemporary United States. It's something that's not happening, and things that are not happening are really hard to spot. But we moved around so much at the peak, and it was the first thing that people who came over to this country usually noticed was how weird we were, that we kept moving from one place to another. And we're a lot less remarkable now than we used to be. And a lot of other things that made America exceptional have faded away as our mobility has faded.
Yeah, one of the things I kept thinking about this when you were writing about, the mobility thing really sort of gets at the heart of American exceptionalism in a whole bunch of non-obvious ways. An American exceptionalism, which a lot of people think means is supposed to mean we're better than everybody. We're just different, is I think one of the more underappreciated aspects of all sorts of fields. But it reminded me, Daniel Boorstin has these great passages. I quoted him in my last book about it, some of them, talking about has these foreign dignitaries coming to the United States in the early mid 1800s, and these ambassadors from Hungary and that kind of thing are just scandalized that Americans don't wear the uniforms of their professions. around. So like, he's like in Budapest, you walk around, and, oh, she's a baker. He's, a blacksmith. And there's like you're born into a uniform. I mean, if you're lucky, if you get on that track, right? You get apprenticed and all that. And then for the rest of your life, that's the station, in effect, the caste that you're born into, and you stick there. In America, it would bother people to find out you couldn't tell if someone was rich or not by their clothing. You couldn't tell what job they did by their clothing. And that was part and parcel of that mobility part.
Yeah, this is the amazing thing about American mobility. This is really a right that we invent in the United States. In most times and places, you were born in a specific place. And I mean that like a literal place that you were legally attached to and couldn't just leave or could be removed back to if you tried to leave, but also a metaphorical place. You had a spot in the social hierarchy, right? Like you inherited your faith, you inherited um, your profession often from, or your occupation from your father. You inherited your place, in that sense of like, oh, don't rise above your station. And then you live there, and you expected to live there and die there, and your children and grandchildren would live there just as your grandparents had lived there. You had a spot, and the amazing thing about American mobility is that by casting loose from place and giving people the right to choose where they wanted to live, we also enable people to cast loose from all of the other ways in which that stuff was inherited. Suddenly, identity became something that you could construct. You could be born a cook's son and end up a millionaire. You could be born the child of a common laborer and end up a doctor, right? When you no longer assign people that station at birth, when you give people the chance to move, to relocate, you also opened up all kinds of possibilities of social mobility and of community that came with it. And that, I think, was the two things that the Europeans noticed. Like one was people are really hard to read over here, right? Like they all want to rise above their station. They all think that they can sort of grab onto their destiny with both hands and take it where they want to go. And the other thing you'll notice is like our communities are incredibly vibrant. We have all of these voluntary associations and organizations, all these clubs, all these ways of getting together to do things collectively instead of relying on the state or doing them ourselves. And those two things are the two sides of the same coin. They hate all of the way that we're mobile. Like they think it's our great national character flaw is that we don't love home enough and we don't accept our place in the world. And they love our voluntary associations, and they really don't get that the two things are driven by the same common characteristic, which is that we're relocating all the time and building communities as we do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, again, there were a lot of things that some of them so run against my preconceived notions that I don't want to necessarily say I've changed my mind about all of them, but I've got to pull the string on them more. But like, the overturning of the Tocquevillian thing, right? Where de Tocqueville has, two basic insights about America. And one is we have all these voluntary associations. Well, he has a bunch of insights about America, but like, but this idea that old institutions for old community-based institutions, that their function is actually much more about matriculating newcomers than being these sort of castles for intergenerational tradition, is a really interesting way to think about this that I hadn't really thought about before.
Yeah, and this is something which, if you've ever been involved in a church or a club, you probably noticed yourself if you think about it. Most of these organizations shed members at a steady rate over time, right? So maybe they're losing 10% of their membership every year. People die, they move, they grow bored or disinterested and stop paying their dues. That tends to be constant over time. What changes for any organization is the rate of accession, how many new members are joining. The people who join organizations tend to be the new arrivals in town. They tend to be people who have just landed there and are looking to get involved in something. And in a society where 1 out of 3 Americans is moving every year, there's this steady flow of new arrivals into almost every community in America. Those are the people who are powering the growth of the voluntary associations. They land there, they're looking to fit in, they're looking to make friends, to establish connections, to build a social network for themselves. So they join. As the rate of mobility slows, there are fewer and fewer new arrivals. The groups still lose membership at the same rate, but they can't replace it anymore. And the groups fall increasingly inactive until we're left bowling alone. But that's not happening because our society grew too mobile. It's happening because we're stuck because we no longer move around from place to place. And it's that impetus which breaks the force of inertia, right? Like you might just want to sit on your couch
Right.
and not go anywhere. It's awkward to force yourself into a new social relationship, to join a new club, to walk into a room where everybody knows everybody else and you're the newcomer. You do it when you have to. You do it when you've moved and you need to build new social ties. You don't do it if you've lived in a community your whole life.
So it's funny. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that touch on different sort of themes of this podcast here, but one of the things that that I don't talk about as much, um, that I kept thinking about as I was working through the book is, so, well, let's put it. I'll do the general and the specific. The one of the things I kept thinking about was like after Hurricane Katrina, there were a bunch of people who were dislocated, poor people, poor black people, um, and they were moved to Houston, relocated to Houston. And I remember reading pieces, this is what, 10, 15 years ago now, about how on all sorts of indicators they were doing better now that they were in Houston. And I always think about that because when I think about my brother who passed away about 10 years ago, had addiction issues. And one of the things I was desperate to do was get him out of New York City. I grew up in New York City. I used to have these conversations with him, with my family, about how, places have ghosts. And if you have bad habits in a place, it's why AA always tells people, break those old habits, don't go back with your old crowd and all that kind of stuff. I think that's a sociological observation as much as it's a psychological one.
Yeah.
And when people are having a bad time of it, just a change of scenery lets you reinvent yourself, reinvent your story in ways that you get an opportunity to be the best version of yourself rather than be constantly reminded of the worst version of yourself. And that's one of those things that's really hard to sort of say, and that's why we need this for public policy. But it's a big part of sort of the American story, at scale and also among individuals.
That's such a profound point, and I'm so sorry for your loss. But this is something that I think touches a lot of people's lives. America's a place that gives second, third, 13th chances. As long as you can pick up and go someplace else, you get the chance to start over, to form a new set of relationships, a new set of habits. And we have the data on this, which is like at a sort of from a dry empirical level. I can tell you that in any decade of American history, the people who moved end up doing better economically than the people who chose to stay put, even if you adjust for everything else. That they were likelier to jump occupational brackets. They were likelier to earn more over the course of their lives. Their kids, like the effects are actually amplified in the second generation. So the children of the movers do even better than the children of those who are stuck. But that's at the sort of measuring things in dollars and cents level. There's also this profound sense of agency and dignity that comes with choosing to relocate. It's not even in the case of a forced dislocation like Katrina. We have very good studies on Katrina, not just in Houston, in states like Colorado, where we can see that the people who left empirically did much better than those who stayed. But most people who leave throughout American history have done so volitionally. And there is something about being in control of your own life, making your own set of choices, choosing to start over, arriving in a new place, and making all those choices. What church will you go and pray in? For 200 years, America has been the only country where most people do not belong to the confession or church into which they were born, because Americans make that an active choice. And that's why we've been a more religious country than Europe throughout that span, because when people are making active choices, they're committing to them. And so when you get that dignity of choice, when you're able to exercise agency in your own life, it lets you do things. And it is, I think, essential to the American character, being able to start over, being able to take hold of your life and have that sense of agency.
Again, I don't dispute that. I was the one who brought it up, but there is a correlation causation issue there, right? I mean, the sorts of people who you're talking about have these good professional outcomes move a lot, but one of the reasons they move a lot is they're sort of the kind of people who have good professional outcomes. It's sort of like the marriage argument. Marriage is good for for capital accumulation, right? It's but the people who really care about capital
Yeah,
accumulation are also more likely to get married. And it doesn't mean that it's only one thing. It's a catalytic thing. Both factors contribute to the non-zero sum part of it. But it's like, go back to the beginning. One of the arguments for American exceptionalism is that we are a country that in many ways was founded by second sons.
right.
Right? It was the under primogeniture, the firstborn son got everything. So if you wanted to be successful, you had to make your own way in the world. You joined the Navy, you joined all these kinds of things. You became an adventurer, and those are the people who came to America who basically started this whole thing, and that culturally passed on in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's got to be something to that, but there are two other things I'd say. One is when you look at populations where there's forced displacement, like post Katrina, you see similar effects,
Right.
right? So if it was just a question of people self-selecting,
Right.
you wouldn't expect to see that. You'd say, okay, well, if these were the people who wouldn't have moved and they relocated, then they don't get the benefits, but they do get the benefits. But the other is my favorite study of this, done by some University of Chicago psychologists who tried to account for this by going and doing a big survey and asking people whether they intended to move in the next year, in the next 5 years. And then they came back to do follow-ups to differentiate between those who've been able to pull it off and those who hadn't. And the people who moved grew more optimistic, more engaged in their communities, more future-oriented in their thinking. So they were planning in advance, and they were likelier to see the success of their communities and their own successes intertwined. Right, the better everyone around them did, the better it would be for them. The people who intended to move, who based on all other observable characteristics were indistinguishable from the people who had moved. They all intended to move, but for one reason or another, they weren't able to do so. Usually, I get into this in the book because we made it too expensive for them to go to the places that they otherwise would have gone. Those people grew more cynical, more alienated, likelier to see the world as a zero-sum game, likelier to see others' gains coming at their expense. And so even when you're adjusting for sort of like the segment of the population that says it wants to move, and that's the segment that says it wants to move and can't move is up by 45% over the last half century. There's a lot of people in this country who have the second son characteristic, right? Like they want to be entrepreneurial, they want to move, they want to take advantage of American mobility. They would have in previous generations. We know what happens when they do. They start to sound like Americans, right? Like optimistic, future-oriented, engaged in their communities. And instead, what we're seeing is a profound social change, whereas more and more people who want to move can't. They're growing detached, cynical, alienated, and it's, you can see that rippling through the society.
All right, so to change gears ever so slightly on this and get at why this is happening. One of the things that bums me out, and this is a topic I talk about here a lot. I like cities. I think cities are really important. I'm a bit of a flaneur, but it seems to me like I grew up in New York City. New York City is becoming so much more European, and what I mean by that is like when you go to Europe and you talk about, in America when I was growing up, when you were growing up, you talk about the inner city. That's synonymous with like poor people. Just that's inner city problems, right? And in Europe, the poor people are all out in the suburbs, right? And the inner city is where the Louvre is, or whatever. It's very fancy, and it's very expensive, and you can get your fifth Rolex watch somewhere, and it's also very sanitized, and the Disneyfication of Times Square is sort of a good example of this. When I was a kid, it was, hookers with razor blades, and now it's people dressed up as Elmo. And my point being is that cities for most of human history were the place where mobility happened. And and I grew up hearing all sorts of stuff, Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, factory fire and all that kind of stuff. My grandparents were in the garment industry, and you have all of these tenements. And the thing that always bothers me is that people talk about, how terrible those tenements were, and they never want to mention the fact that poor people were desperate to live in them and to move there. So why don't you just talk about like the whole progressive reformers jihad on cheap housing in big cities?
Yeah, let me offend people. Tenements were great. Right? Like this is one of the surprises of the research here is that if you want to measure this on an outcome basis, you look at the populations that were living in New York City tenements 100 years ago. And the reformers said, these apartments are inherently corrupting. They breed vice and immorality. They will trap people in intergenerational poverty. This is the era of eugenics. And they even went further. They said, they are breeding inferior populations. Only the worst sorts of people can survive in tenements. And so with each generation that lives in the tenements, humanity will descend a step further. They were really, they blame everything on tenements except jazz, as best I can tell. Like any bad social change of the era is the fault of tenements. But then you look at the people who lived in those tenements, and they do fine, actually. They show, in general, more economic and upward mobility than any other immigrant population in American history, right? So it's really, really hard to go back and look at the tenements and take the reformers all that seriously. And when you go and look at the research that was done at the time on tenements, what you persistently see is that the reformers are highlighting the worst and most egregious examples, and that the broad surveys say, no, most of these homes were well kept, relatively clean, allowed immigrant populations to be housed in a city that was going to give them a ton of opportunity, and allowed people to move up relatively quickly and often out of the tenements. Look, I went back to my great-grandfather's tenement, which was one of these buildings that the reformers said was going to corrupt anyone who lived in it and morally degrade them. And I couldn't rent the place now. It's $7,200 a month with cherry wood floors. Like same apartment, different rental.
Better kitchen now, I'm assuming.
Yeah, no, it does have like stainless steel appliances, which I don't think he had at the time. So it's come up a little bit. But there was nothing wrong with apartment living per se. What was wrong was these were people arriving without very much, who weren't given very much opportunity. And as they were given more opportunity, as the barriers of discrimination lowered a little bit, and they were able to ascend and work hard and save up, they moved up. What the reformers really hated was immigrants. And they're pretty clear about this in private. And tenement regulation was mostly a means of trying to restrict immigrant populations. There's this one moment where I was researching things and came across a conference proceedings. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you're sort of like looking for something and wondering whether or not you're being fair to your subject. And then I came across this page where the leading tenement reformer is at a conference, and somebody says, how do we block apartment buildings? And he says, well, there's actually a big problem there. People like apartments, so you can't just put it to a vote. Democratically, you'll lose. But I have this one weird trick I've been using in New York. You just call it fire safety regulation. And then you layer on a ton of rules, and you make the tenements unaffordable to build. But be very careful, he says. Don't put those same rules on single or two-family homes, because you're not actually trying to protect them against fire. You're just trying to make them unaffordable. And so you need to make sure that the single and two-family homes stay cheap. And you rarely have sort of a confession in writing that the great regulatory reform project of the era is actually just an anti-immigrant project. But he said the quiet part loud, and he's the guy who makes tenements almost illegal to build, certainly unaffordable to build. And when we do that, when we make cities too expensive for people to move there and do better there, then we really took something off that's important in America.
So I'm a conservative guy, although by today's definitions, because I don't like Trump, that people say, no, you're not, and I roll my eyes. But one of the places where I've always been a little sort of hard to pin down is that one of my favorite historians is a Marxist historian, Gabriel Kolko, or neo-Marxist or quasi-Marxist, I don't, because he attacks the progressive era from the left.
He's got a great book on railroad regulation.
Yeah. I mean, it's great stuff. And you have to take, he's got his biases, but it's interesting, and the facts are the facts and the quotes are the quotes, and you can check them out yourself. And, and one of the points that he and some others, had made was that the progressive era, like a lot of the stuff I learned at Rodolph Scholem Day School, that, or Dwight Brevin in New York, about how awesome the progressive era was, is kind of propagandistic. And so The Jungle, which I had to read, the whole Upton Sinclair meatpacking industry thing. It turns out that the meatpacking industry was entirely in favor of that book. They liked the idea of these regulations because the regulations served to crowd out competition. They were like the thing you're talking about to make how apartments too expensive. Most big business under, from Wilson to FDR was very much in favor of the same thing, not necessarily to keep out immigrants, they like that labor, but to keep out small business competitors. And I'm just kind of curious, race and class factor into a big part of your story, but does that aspect of it factor in there too?
Yeah,
Because you can see the building construction industry would want to be on the other side of this, and yet they lost these arguments so much.
Yeah, it works both ways, right? So Kolko is talking about regulatory capture. What happens when big business and big government get in bed together? And the answer is nothing good for the American consumer. It's written, as you say, from the left, but it's a critique that the right shares as well at various times. The original progressive impulse 100 years ago was mostly about the search for order. They wanted science and reason and expertise to reign. And it carried with it a real strong distaste and distrust for small d democracy. You couldn't let immigrants in cities just vote for the policies they wanted because they didn't know it was best for them. And that disdain for popular democracy carries through several areas of progressive reformers. There's an inherent tension there, right? Where this plays out with small business in the way you're asking is that many of the original people who were building the tenements, they tended to be immigrants themselves. That's who went into the industry. You didn't face employment discrimination if you could scrape together a loan from some of your friends and build and operate a small apartment building, which is what a tenement was. And then if you did well with that, you could leverage it with a bank and build a second one and a third. So housing construction in that era tended to be sort of a enterprise for small businessmen, for immigrant businesses. And the regulations have made it increasingly difficult to build. And this actually has sort of a doubly perverse effect. One is today, where if you're trying to build in a city, you're better off hiring a lawyer than an architect. Just navigating the web of rules, even in most suburbs, is the most time-consuming and arduous part of the process, right? So it's corporations that have resources that can, bear the cost of capital for some regulatory approval process of indeterminate length that can most afford to construct things today. But perversely, it's also a highly balkanized market. So construction is one of the only parts of American industry where we really haven't seen productivity gains to speak of in decades, because it's such a highly fragmented market. So what you get is, in every locality, you get a handful of large builders that sort of dominate the market. But you don't get the efficiency gains that come with scale either, because you can't get large enough building across multiple areas for the most part, because each one gives its own, if the thing that makes you a successful builder is mostly being able to navigate the rules, then that expertise doesn't transfer from one jurisdiction to another. So you end up with this worst of both worlds. On the one hand, yeah, you get the regulatory capture and you get the builders who have muscled out the little guy, and then on the other hand, you don't get the kind of consolidation that delivers lower prices for consumers, because it's so balkanized by the regulation that you can't get the efficiencies of scale. And so you get both critiques. Usually those are separate, contrasting critiques, and in construction, really, we've produced a worst of all worlds scenario.
Yeah, I love me some regulatory capture talk, but it seems to me like it's not just knowing the rules on the books, it's knowing the unwritten rules, right? Like who to pay off, right? Or who to flatter, or because like I know someone who's big into construction, and he would say, look, I'm not a particularly charming guy, but I know how to charm a certain kind of public official. He wasn't saying he knows how to bribe them, but he knows how to schmooze them, right? Because there's so much of that kind of stuff going on at the city level,
Yeah, I'll give you a historical example of this, right? One of the questions that you can ask yourself is like, how did America ever screw up badly enough that we passed Prohibition? One of maybe the main driving force behind Prohibition was actually municipal corruption. By the time we get Prohibition, most cities have license laws for liquor licenses. There's an enormous amount of money riding on who gets those licenses and who doesn't. And the liquor businesses had more riding on each municipal election than anyone else did. The bribery is rampant. the corruption of public officials is rampant. One of the things that drives America toward prohibition is sort of a to hell with it. We got to clean up municipal government kind of attitude, because once you make it so that people's entire businesses rest on who is in power and exactly how the rules work, that is an inherently corrupting force in local politics. And we see the same thing today with the building industry for exactly the reasons you're saying. Whether they're following the laws or not, those are often the businesses in any municipality who have the most riding on who's in power, who have the most that depends on what decisions get made. And when you end up with a situation like that, it's not just bad for building. It's bad for everybody else who has business before the city government, because that's what's really driving the politics. They're not paying attention to the other things that matter more.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm not the first to make this observation, but I do think that, like, unless you understand what it took to build crappy housing in the 1970s in New York, and to make money at it, you cannot understand Donald Trump's political philosophy or his understanding of politics. And the sort of having politicians in your pocket, again, whether it's illegal or legally corrupt or just politically corrupt, is kind of beside the point. It explains so much of how, like, he sees America, he sees politics as that kind of transactional thing. And anyway, we can come back to Trump in a bit. I do want to switch gears again. So one of the things I talk about a lot, lots of people talk about a lot, it's right and it's wrong. Let's put it that way. You kind of overturn the popular understanding of the big sort, right? That how we become polarized because people have self-selected to live in different communities where they agree with each other and all of that. And that turns out to be not exactly right. So why don't you kind of work us through that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of backwards. In fact, it's not that nobody ever chooses a community based on their politics. Clearly, that happens. But over the same 50 years, when we've been growing more and more polarized, that's the same 50 years I'm talking about. We're moving less and less. So it's really hard for me to buy a story that says we're sorting ourselves out by increased mobility, which is the claim of the big sword, when we're moving less and less. What I actually see is a story that's acting in the opposite way. When Americans moved a lot, and they moved generally for economic reasons, it meant that when a city was booming, it was drawing people from all over. It was drawing people of varied life experiences, of radically different political commitments, and then mixing them together cheek by jowl. When the guy sitting next to you in the pew on Sunday or working next to you on the assembly line has a political belief which is the opposite of yours, but you got to work together anyway. Uh, um, you may moderate your views, you may learn to live alongside others. You may fight a lot, right? Like, there's lots of reactions you can have to that. But what you're not going to get is the kind of sharp geographic polarization that we have. The other thing we know, and the political science literature is really good on this, is that people are conformist by nature. If you move a bunch of people into a county that has really strong common political beliefs or cultural values, people will tend to change their own opinions over time to match those of their neighbors. Or at least 9 out of 10 will. There's always the one guy who moves into the neighborhood and does exactly the opposite as everyone
Right.
else. But that's not the normal human trajectory, right? Most of us want to fit in. That's true in high school. It's true when you move as an adult. And so what we actually see is that in communities that get relatively little turnover, those strong homogenizing forces,
Right.
those forces of conformity, lead people to line up their beliefs with each other, to polarize, and to become more extreme. If you're mixing in people constantly from new backgrounds, it keeps that from happening. It keeps the discussion within the community is constantly getting revived by the arrival of people who have different experiences and different views, and you don't get the same kind of polarization and homogenization. So I don't think we're sorting ourselves out. I think what's happening is we're stagnating. We should be mixing ourselves together, and a high rate of mobility is what achieves that. And when people can no longer afford to move toward the places with opportunity, that's when you get the really sharp, polarized politics that we're seeing now.
Yeah, I mean, the explanation behind the big sword is wrong. I'm convinced, you persuaded me that But descriptively, it's right. I mean, the polarization is happening. It's just
Yeah,
not happening for the reasons people think it is. It does. It kind of reminds me of um, uh, genetics a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of eugenics in this story that you're telling, and I know progressives were into it, but that's not what I'm getting at. I just mean that like mongrels are healthier than purebreds. I'm a big dog guy, and democracy is healthier. Communities are healthier in their politics when there's a lot of variation, right? And
yeah.
when it's all Rottweilers or all poodles, you get a lot of inbreeding, and you get a lot of problems, and you get a lot of character, a lot of outsized, caricatures of things, because there's no check to pull it back in. And I think that's sort of the ideologically what happens with the big sword, right? Is
I
that
think yeah,
it's
you're getting it
people
right.
reinforcing each other constantly.
And that constant reinforcement is not healthy. I mean, you can see it. We all know this effect from social media, where you can get people sorting themselves out in filter bubbles and polarizing their beliefs and growing more and more extreme. And the same thing happens in the real world. If you're living in a community where everybody agrees with you, and the question is like, do you have the vanilla version of this political belief or the more and more extreme one?
Right.
That community will tend over time toward the more and more extreme ones, because people are constantly going to try to conform. The center will keep shifting over, and what you'll find is a community that not only has grown, uniformly blue or uniformly red, but grows deeper blue or deeper red over time, and it's a real worrying trend. And we had an antidote to it. The antidote was that we moved a lot, and as we've choked that off, it's killing our politics.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny. I have this theory that I've wanted to write about for years now, a couple of years. One of the reasons why the American Revolution works and the French Revolution doesn't is that the American Revolution, a lot of our most important meetings were held in private, and the French Revolution, they're all public. And so the person who played to the crowd took ever more extreme positions, got reinforced by the cheers of the crowd. The moderates, the Lafayettes, got booed down. And so people will then have to lock into ever more extreme positions until the guillotine comes out. I'm shorthanding it, but that's the gist of it. I think the era of social media kind of does that too, where everyone in an attention economy, everybody wants to get attention and be the maverick and be the rebel and all that kind of stuff. So they ratchet ever further out there. And then other people have to catch up or leapfrog over them. And so even if that's not happening at the town meeting, social media feeds into that sorting part, because people are being performative with virtual communities in ways that you couldn't really do in real life. But
Yeah,
anyway,
Yuval Levin has made this point about our Congress right now,
right.
that is acting, with all the transparency laws that we put in place, is growing increasingly performative, and less able to arrive at any kind of deal making or consensus. And yeah, there's a real downside to that.
Okay, so I probably did short shrift to the book or the reader or the listeners. Why don't you just, because the real villain in this is zoning, right? I mean, that's at the end
That's
of
the
the
villain.
day, the villain is zoning and the zoners. And so why don't you do this short history of where it starts in Modesto, I think I remember, right?
Yeah,
And um and how it spreads.
yeah. So Modesto starts, this sort of the dirty laundry of zoning. It starts in Modesto, California, in 1885, where the town fathers want to push out the Chinese, and they try various things to push out the Chinese, like vigilante violence. They don hoods and they march through the streets, smashing things and beating people up, and the Chinese rebuild because they want their piece of the American dream. And then they try arson, and they can't burn them out either. And then they do something really brutal. They hit on zoning. They write a law which basically pushes all the Chinese laundries, which was the prime employer, into Chinatown, without ever using those words. It says west of the tracks and south of G Street. It doesn't say China, and it doesn't say Chinatown, but it's a way to segregate the city using land use law. And this idea is really powerful. Once cities figure out that they can segregate populations by segregating the uses of buildings, they push that, right? In New York, it's used to push the Jews back into the Lower East Side. That's where we got our first citywide zoning ordinance. And then it spreads. It spreads nationally, under Herbert Hoover, who helps popularize it, under FDR, who makes it a matter of federal policy. If you want a home loan in this country in the 1930s, you have to restrict your neighborhood by race and you have to zone it. the feds won't give you a loan if you don't do those things. And it becomes sort of this national thing. But zoning alone doesn't kill American mobility. It separates us out, it constricts opportunity, it segregates the population by class and by race. But the real history that the book tells is that this is a two-step process. Zoning takes what were private decisions about what you did with your own land and turns them into things that were governmental decisions. Now the government has to decide what you are and are not allowed to do on every plot of land. That was new until the early 20th century. We had nothing like that. We had rules. It wasn't total chaos, but the rules had to apply equally everywhere. And the rules were based on harm. So you couldn't do anything on your property that was going to hurt your neighbors. But if what you were doing wasn't hurting anyone, it was yours to do. Zoning makes everything a matter of government approval. And then the second turn in this story is in the 1960s. There is a group of left-wing reformers who are correctly worried that government has been captured, just the way we were talking about, by big business. And their solution to this is to arm anyone with a veto, with the ability to challenge any government decision in court, whether or not that decision has directly harmed them. It's a set of legal changes that shifts what it takes to challenge a government decision, and essentially means that anyone with enough time and education and money can go to court and challenge any decision they don't like. It's done for good reasons, I think, initially. They're worried about, cars that are not safe and are death traps. They're worried about chemicals that are killing all the birds. I mean, there are real problems with government decision making. But rather than saying we should elect different politicians or we should have different policies, what they say is we should empower the public to challenge the government. And what you get over the next 50 years is just absolute sclerosis. It becomes impossible to build in the places where we're adding the most economic opportunity. And that's just so weird historically. Whenever anyone wants to build anything large in those places, or maybe just a new house, the neighbors can sue. They can sue to stop it. They can go to the hearings. They can gum up the regulatory process, and they can make it cost prohibitive for that expansion to take place. Or if it does take place, it's been so expensive that the housing that it yields is too small a number and too expensive for most people who want to move there. And I'll tell you, because all of that sounds sort of abstract, but the way I kept thinking about this as I was reporting the book, talking to people, I spent a week in Flint, Michigan, asking people why do you live here? We've got this thing called the Opportunity Atlas, which ranks by percentile census tracts around the country. So I was walking around census tracts in Flint that were in the first percentile. These are among the worst places in America to raise your kid based on outcomes in adulthood. But there's lots of families living there. And so I asked them, why are you here? And they give all the standard reasons. Nobody ever wants to move. They're there for family. They're there because their church is there. They're there for community because their parents live there. They've grown up there. And then if you keep asking, they start talking about the times they tried to move. Most of them have at some point. One guy said, I went to Miami and crashed with a friend in his apartment. I got a job, but then he moved. I couldn't afford the lease on my own, so I came back here. That is what this has meant in practice, is that people who are living someplace where there isn't much for them, who would like to move to a place where there's a lot more opportunity, no longer can afford it. For 200 years, people moved from the poorer places in America to the richer places. That slows starting in the 1970s. It's actually reversed the last 20 years. Now people move from the richer places in America to the places where the housing is cheap. And that's fine if you're looking for cheap housing, but it's not fine if you're looking for opportunity for your kid. It's not fine if you're looking for a better job for yourself. And so that's the story here, is that first zoning and then the ability to challenge zoning decisions made it impossible to build where people actually wanted to live, and is driving the American population away from the places where the economy is growing fast, away from the places where they could start businesses, away from the places where they could get better jobs, and out to the outskirts where the housing is cheap.
I mean, I'm totally convinced it's part of the story, right? But one of the rules here is we are against monocausal explanations of anything. And I remember, lots of people have written about this, but the one that always sticks out, my friend Ron Bailey, who was from rural Virginia around the time, Hillbilly Elegy came out, when J.D. Vance was a different J.D. Vance. Ron wrote this great piece where he visited basically it was more or less the same part of the Appalachian poverty area. And one of the big takeaways he had was that that the way the welfare programs work, everything from SSI to all the acronyms, it's more expensive to get to get a job than to get an entry wage job than it is to stay on benefits. And even if you were still qualified for some of the benefits, you lose them if you move, or at least that's the perception, right? Because you were plugged into a local welfare state system, a local social safety net, and the barrier to entry to enter into a new one is so daunting for people, particularly people who, like one of the buzz phrases on this podcast from the beginning has always been complexity is a subsidy. That the more complex you make society, the more you are subsidizing the people with either the cognitive or the financial or the social capital to navigate those complexities. And the people who don't have any of those things, or not all of those things, are going to do worse. And so you create barriers to entry from below to get to the middle by coming up with all these complex rules. And that's not necessarily a story just of housing or of zoning. It's something that what is the line from Orwell where he says a man can feel himself a failure and take to drink and could become all the more of a failure because he drinks, right? Like two problems can make can have a larger impact than just the sum of the two problems.
Yeah, no, and I share your caution about monocausal explanations, but I'm going to try to convince you that this is the big cause anyway.
Okay, fair enough.
And I think you're still telling me a story about declining mobility. You're talking about some of the inputs that incentivize people to stay where they are. And these are real inputs. I talked to a woman in Flint who was in a HUD-subsidized apartment for $145 a month. Her sisters were in Texas. She thought about moving to Texas, asked them about the housing prices down there. Well, HUD's not going to give her an apartment in Texas for $145 a month. So she's staying in Flint, right? That's a government subsidy that is keeping her in a place of diminishing opportunity. And many of our other benefit systems function the same way. They're tuned to support people on the assumption that they're going to stay where they are, rather than being tuned to support people making active choices about where they want to live. And so, yeah, it's not just zoning and housing, although I think that's by far the largest factor. We have a whole range of government policies that basically regarded mobility as a threat. Mobility is it's unsettling, right? People moving around and making these choices, places rising and falling, cities going boom and bust. It is something that planners are allergic to. They look at that and they say, God, if only we could just make people happy where they were, we wouldn't have all this chaos, all this unpredictability, all of this change. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of policies in this country that have been basically tuned to keep people where they are, at least, tuned for an assumption of stasis. And you can look at that, you really want to see this contrast. It's not Appalachia versus New York, it's Europe versus the US. In a society where you basically assume people are going to stay where they're born, you have to provide a really robust social welfare state because the jobs are going to move. And then you've got to reallocate from the places that are really producing economic growth to the places that aren't. The people are stagnant. The capital, the job market is mobile, and so you reallocate. That's one way you can build a society, and that works for some of them. The other way you can build a society is assume that you're going to keep the people mobile. And my critique here really is that the United States now has the worst of both worlds. We have a very stingy welfare state on the whole, which is mostly still tuned for encouraging stasis, but it's not robust like the European social democracies. And it didn't need to be because we had a society that was tuned to mobility. We assumed that if all the jobs left, the people would leave. But they can't do that anymore. When we hit the China shock, when jobs went south and north with NAFTA, people did not move toward where the new jobs were being created because the housing costs would have left them further behind. And so that's the real shift, is that for 200 years, we assumed that people were going to move in response to the economy. Now we've got all kinds of policies that discourage them from moving. I mean, the problem of hollowed out places is not new. This is one of my favorite stats in the book. In 1900, more than 40% of the people in Vermont who were born in Vermont didn't live in Vermont anymore. The only place on earth with a comparative outmigration was Ireland after the potato famine, right? We all know the story of Ireland sort of losing all of its young people and that massive migration. Well, the same thing happened in Vermont. It just wasn't a good place to be anymore. There wasn't a lot of opportunity there. Um, but Vermont did not become mired in intergenerational poverty because the people left. And when they left, they were able to send money back to support the old folks in Vermont. Um, the flight of the population from Vermont tightened up the labor market and drove up wages there, supporting the people who had stayed. Like, that's how it used to work. Places lost opportunity, Americans moved. That helped those places recover, and then they could swing around. And there are parts of Vermont now that I can't afford. So it's not like a single arc, but you got to let people move if you want that to happen, or you got to build a really robust social welfare state, but you can't do neither. And right now, a lot of Americans are mad because we won't let them move toward the opportunity, and we're not paying them to stay where they are. And that's a really miserable place to be.
So it's funny. Back when I was at National Review, there was a raging debate that divided readers, divided staff, um, between Michael Brendan Doherty and my now Dispatch colleague and your very brief colleague, Kevin Williamson, about, I think it was Garbett, New York or something like that. And Kevin took the position that you're taking, which was that towns rise and die all the time in American history. Some industry, there's a mine. The mine is productive for X amount of years, then it stops being productive, and people move. Some industry is thriving for a while, then people get tired of pet rocks and the factory closes, whatever it is, right? And and Michael Brennan Doherty, who, it should not be surprising, is probably in National Review world the foremost supporter of J.D. Vance, who has this sort of Appalachian blood and soil kind of argument about his family graveyard going back 12 generations and all that, which actually my wife wrote a piece for you guys criticizing. And what is strange to me, first of all, it's just very reminiscent of that argument, yeah. Right? But second of all, what is strange to me is that, this is a point that David French used to make all the time, that something's going wrong with your analysis of the culture war if you think your side always loses, because the other side thinks its side is always losing too, right? So, but you can't have two sides that both think they're also losing. Mm-hmm. But what is weird is that the people who are most committed to stay putism, right, to being in one place, to rootedness, are the most convinced that the country is incredibly mobile, right, and that there's just too much change and all of that kind of stuff. And the people who are incredibly mobile, they seem to think, well, I guess, I don't know, they seem to, everyone seems to think that the country's incredibly mobile too, still, I guess. So it's not quite like the culture war thing. Why is that? Is it just because the people who are really mobile only know other really mobile people?
Yeah, so I think it's a big part of it, right? Is that the people in America who can still afford to move are the elite. They're the best educated, the most affluent, and their lives remain actually remarkably mobile. There's nostalgia that comes with that. America has always had this sort of cottage industry of small town nostalgia because we're always leaving. We invent homecoming. Only in America could you have homecoming at the high school, because only in America are you going to find enough people who have left town to make that an event. We've always made nostalgia central. What is weird about this debate that you're pointing to, right? I remember Kevin writing something like "back up the U-Haul," right? I'm not that prescriptive. I don't think I'm not telling people they have to leave. I am observing, though, that people usually want to leave. That many people are willing to make that trade-off. And then feel nostalgic for the place they've left, even though they're not going back. Every time somebody criticizes me about this mobility thesis, I look up where they're living. There was a gentleman, longtime editor of Governing magazine, who wrote a column yesterday attacking me and suggesting that small towns are where it's at. And I checked, and he was born wherever he was born, and now he lives in Arlington, Virginia. Invariably, these people live in San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., maybe a couple of them in Boston. Almost none of them live where they were born. And this is just like my favorite pastime now, is that the Washington Monthly attacked the book, and Washington D.C., right? And the people who are editing it, were all born someplace and all moved to chase opportunity to Washington. And this just happens over and over and over again. It's very easy to be nostalgic about small towns if you're not living there. I watched Rod Dreher go through this up and down cycle where he moved back to a small town and went there praising its virtues, and it did not work for him the way he expected. Small towns, what we knew when we were a nation of small towns is that they involve trade-offs too, just like cities do. They tend to be more censorious. It's very, very hard to put your past behind you in a small town. It's very hard to start over, and it can be hard to reinvent yourself or to chase new opportunity in a small town. For the people who want to stay in small towns, great. I'm so glad they're happy there. But we were a country which said, you have the right to move. You don't have to be defined by the circumstances of your birth. You can make of life what you will. And if I phrase it not, we often argue about, like, what should we do about the town? I think it's the wrong question to ask. The question is not, what do you do about a dying town? The question is, what do you do about the people? Can I really look somebody in the eye and say, I think the federal government should give you a several $1,000s a year subsidy to stay put where your kid's going to have no opportunity? Or should I look at that person and say, I'd love to build a society where you can make your own choices about your life? And once you get down to the level of the people, a lot of place-based policy just doesn't look the same. Because I can be as nostalgic and romantic as I want about that small town. But if I got to look a mother in the eye and say, I'm going to rig federal policy in every way I can to incentivize you to stay someplace where your child's prospects will be diminished, that's a hard conversation.
Yeah, no, it's funny. About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was the Reformicon boomlet with my colleagues Yuval Levin and Michael Strain and Ramesh and some others. And I was not part of that group, but I was sympathetic, partly because I had so many other friends in it. And I have a healthy skepticism of technocrats, but I've come around on some of it. And one of the ideas that I thought was kind of batty when I first heard it, that Michael Strain proposed, I'm now really into, which is, would you say, should you give someone a subsidy to stay in a dysfunctional, dying economy? His idea was, no, you give them a subsidy to move out of it, right? And he wanted to give people basically like vouchers, because he says, look, there are lots of jobs available in this country. It's just that the people who need them live in other places.
Yeah.
So pay them to move. And I mean, it's kind of like coming in from over the top to fix a problem. I would rather some more bottom up solutions, but I can't really argue with it. If you're going to be spending the money anyway to pay people essentially not to be working, pay them to actually have some agency in their lives, get away from the ghosts that I talked about with, like, my brother and, all that kind of stuff, and give them a shot. Like Minnesota can be your 18th century, 19th century California if you can get there. So get them to Minnesota,
Yeah, look, there's a great pilot study of this where they spent a little bit of money on families that said they wanted to move, just helping them figure out the process, just helping them figure out, like, how do you rent in a better neighborhood? How do you go to a city that's going to have a job for you? And just giving that little bit of coaching totally changed their prospects.
Yeah.
If you're stuck someplace and you don't know how to get out, and it's been so long since Americans have regularly moved, it used to be that the word of mouth did this, right? That one of your neighbors, went to a new factory that was opening in some city and wrote a letter back home and said, look, it's great here. Good jobs, we're hiring, you should move too. You can crash at my place until you're up and running. And then somebody would move and you get a whole chain. That doesn't happen as much anymore because nobody's moving. So, we can prime the pump a little bit. That there are some good policies that are being piloted either on a nonprofit or a governmental basis that say, okay, if we want to give Americans back a sense of agency in their own lives, what are ways we can do that? How do we help them a little bit navigate what's become a bewildering system, so that they can go back and make their own choices? And that's the kind of subsidy I can really get behind, because you are teaching the man to fish. Um, you are giving people the tools that they need to take control of their lives, and that is the most effective kind of welfare spending there is.
All right, so I mentioned to you before we get started, I'm going to be talking to Mark Dunkelman in a couple hours. It turns out today was Abundance Progressive Day at the Remnant. I don't think it's going to be a permanent day on our calendar, but it's nice. And I find all of this sort of fascinating for a bunch of different reasons. One, I was talking to Virginia Postrel about this, is like she has an interesting dichotomy. She says, there's basically two groups out there that are aligned, but also there's friction, and it's the progressives who want to remove red tape from government so that government can be more effective, and then there are the sort of progressives who want to move red tape from the private sector so that the private sector can thrive. Seems to me I'm a both and on that, right? I mean, devil's in the details, but that's fine. What I find sort of, first of all, I'm curious if you see it that way, but second of all, again, as I was briefing you in this familiar refrain to many of my listeners who complain about me bringing it up, I'm going to go down with the ship on this point that neoconservatism was not first and foremost a thing about bagel snarfing warmongers. It was about former liberals, former progressives, who, following the data, realized that often for the best of intentions, but not always, the left had gone too far and had sort of ridden the horse of utopianism beyond the bounds of where empiricism and the data lie, right? So James Q. Wilson, Ed Banfield, Nat Glazer, you can go down that whole list, right? And in part because the Iraq War and all that has so poisoned the term neoconservative, we don't have a label for it anymore that we can use, because whenever I accuse, Jonathan Haidt, John McWhorter, Yasha Monk, you can go down this long list of people. Whenever I accuse them of incipient neoconservatism, they blanch like I've called them Satan worshippers. But it seems to me very reminiscent of the same phenomenon. And I'm not saying that you've become conservative or anything like that, but I have not dipped heavily into the reviews of this, but I will bet blind large sums of money that you've gotten more criticism from the left than you've gotten from the right. And that a lot of the wonky neocon gitchy-goo good government guys who I call my friends and colleagues at AEI or the Manhattan Institute and those kinds of places, I haven't read them, but I'm just betting they've been like, welcome to welcome in, the water's great, or it's so nice to hear someone from this side acknowledging this, that, and the other thing. I don't think he goes far enough at this, but like respectful engagement, right? I'm kind of curious, what has been the reception? Respond to any and all of that, but like, what has been the reception from the left and from the right, and also what do you find to be the most compelling? I mean, it's more fun to talk about the least compelling criticisms.
Yeah.
But, what are the most what are the most compelling? And if you want to throw in some responses to the least compelling, that's fine too, because I know authors like to do
Sure.
that.
No, that's always fun too. Yeah, on the whole, I think it's gotten a friendlier reception on the right, because it is fundamentally a critique of both government and private sector regulation, right? It says, one way to think about this is that pendulums, and Mark Dunkelman's book gets into this, but pendulums swing back and forth in American politics. We had a long period in which I think there was a very good case for much more regulation. I mean, I think you can't look around the environment circa 1970 and not say, God, we got to clean this up.
Yeah.
Acid rain is killing the forest. The Cuyahoga River is on fire. Like, something is badly wrong here, and it needs government intervention, right? So you can, that pendulum swung, and it was an important pendulum to swing, and I fully support all of that. But I think one reason you're hearing many people who identify with the progressive tradition come out with these critiques of the regulatory state is the sense that the pendulum swung too far. That many of these things were well intentioned, but if ultimately, it's not even red tape. It is a concern over harm, I think, that drives a lot of this. Progressives became convinced that the most virtuous thing they could do was protect against potential harms, protect every group against those harms by giving everybody a seat at the table, by consulting everyone, by vetoing anything that could ever do harm. And that, when the harms were enormous and widespread, was a really good idea. Over time, what that's done, I think, is create a policy process in which almost nothing ever passes muster, because there's always somebody who's getting harmed. And if your goal is the avoidance of harm, almost invariably your solution is going to be do nothing. Because if you do nothing, if you live in stasis, then like you're not committing fresh harms. And I prefer to think in terms of trade-offs, right? Like you're right, it is bad for small towns if many people leave. Like there's a pain and a trade-off there. I can make you a robust case out of the economic literature that in the long run that town will be better off, but it does not change the pain of a grandparent who watches their grandkids move out of town, right? Like there are trade-offs. It is very difficult to formulate any kind of public policy without trade-offs. But I wrote this book in part because I came to believe that the opportunity costs of not acting have grown to far outweigh the costs of action, that the effort by many progressives to avoid harm is now creating the very harms they were trying to avoid. Like all of this regulation had a few key goals. It was supposed to diminish inequality. Well, inequality is up. It was supposed to reduce sprawl. Sprawl is up because you can't build in dense places. Like it's supposed to protect the environment. It's driving global warming. Like there are lots of things that these regulations were supposed to do. And I have to take a step back and say, that the trade-offs are the wrong trade-offs. The avoidance of harm has really led progressives down a policy path that is producing exactly the opposite of all of the outcomes they say they are about, and they gotta take stock. So yeah, I've gotten some critiques of the book. I think the one that stings the most is the charge that it's just wildly unrealistic to expect people to build. That I am basically writing a book that is a prescription for political suicide, that says the only way to save America is to convince people that they have to let somebody build an apartment in their neighborhood. And that the backlash against this kind of building will necessarily doom the project. And maybe that's right. That there's a lot of NIMBYism out there. There are a lot of people who don't like building. But I tend to think that if you reframe a conversation away from the buildings and out toward the people whose lives can be impacted, if you ask people like, do you think that the nurses and the childcare workers and the firefighters in your community ought to be able to raise their own kids in your community, that there's a way to make this all politically saleable, that people do want those things. They want young families to move in. They want to live in a place that's growing and thriving. And they're willing, if they see it not in terms of the avoidance of harm, but in terms of that's a good trade for me to be making, that there's still a way to move forward. A lot of liberals are attacking the book as well because they think I'm missing the big actors, right? That it's rapacious corporations and Reaganism that have destroyed America, and here I am writing about progressives and blaming the victim, and that one doesn't sting. That one I have to look at and say, nope, that there are lots of problems in America, but what I'm looking at is the prime driver of inequality, of slower economic growth, of reduced prospects, of an America that full of people who are bitter and see the world as a zero-sum game. And ultimately, I am convinced that was a bunch of, I think, fairly well-intentioned progressive regulatory changes that delivered a country where nothing could get done. And when I look at that, and people attack me for it, I think, okay, now I'm provoking the kind of reaction that I was trying to provoke. I'm making people think.
Yeah, I mean, I find that last part sort of so ridiculous insofar as like this, I think it was Walter Russell Mead, but it might have been Joel Cochran came up with the phrase "blue state model," right? I mean, whatever, like the states that have had a near total or total progressive monopoly on political power for generations it just becomes very difficult to say, okay, it's all because of these evil factors, outside of our control, right? You've had lots of opportunity to respond to these things. I just want to say, because I don't think I let you make it abundantly clear. Like, the basic point of the book is that a lot of problems get solved. We can argue about how many, but I think anybody who reads it can agree a huge number of problems get solved or get improved, right? Because you're talking about trade-offs. Tom
Sure.
Sowell's guy said there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? But a huge number of improvements could be made if housing was just abundant, right? The more abundant it is, scarcity raises prices, abundance lowers prices. Prices become a barrier to entry and a barrier to moving. And so a lot of people understand this argument when it comes to energy, right? The cheaper energy is, the more things you can do. It's like, that's what the word energy kind of means, right? Housing is like that. It's like the cheaper it is, the more agency people have to improve their lives or to do what they want to do. Maybe they just want to be poets. It doesn't matter, but like, it gives people more freedom. And the American project was started with this idea that mobility is another word for freedom.
Yes.
And we've kind of lost that. And I think that part really, really, really comes through.
And I'm asking people not to believe their own lying eyes. I just want to acknowledge that, right? Like, one of the reasons that this is a tough argument to digest is that if you've lived in a place with new construction, somebody has told you, we have a housing shortage, and then they built new units down the road from you, and then the prices went up anyway. And so, within the bounds of observed experience, many Americans have had the experience of being told it's a supply problem, and then they add supply, and then the problem gets worse. And so I'm really asking people to take a step back and to understand that we have 50 years of lack of supply. We are millions and millions and millions of housing units short of where we need to be. And building 10 down the road is not going to solve the problem. The prices will keep rising because the demand is still rising. And so, yeah, I want people to take that step back, and in exactly the way that you have framed it, better than I did, thank you, was, this is really about human freedom. This is really
Right.
about giving that fundamental liberty to shape your own life. And the thing that always unlocked it, which we took for granted because it was not a problem until 50 years ago, was that when you wanted to move someplace, there would be a place to live. And you could choose to move into that community and to live there. And if we can restore that, if we can, again, just let people build the places to live in the communities where Americans want to live, I'm not telling anyone they got to move. But if you do want to move, and there ought to be a place for you to move into, and the market, which has its flaws, is actually very good at that particular thing, at accommodating demand, at responding to it, at providing supply when supply is short. And all we got to do is let it do its thing by peeling back enough regulation that Americans can again take control of their own lives and exercise their freedom.
All right, Yoni Appelbaum, thank you so much for doing this. I got a lot out of this book. I'm really grateful for it, and it was also great prep to go to talk to Mark Dunkelman. And so the book is Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Thanks again.